Okay, great. So we're here with our final segment of this year's forum about leveraging FaceBase in related health domains. And actually, the moderator today is Carl Kesselman, our very own PI.
All right. So this is it. As the saying goes, I'm standing between you and lunch. So our final session, and this will be a little bit interesting, is as the topic is leveraging FaceBase related health domains. And to really shake things up, we have some people here who actually are not using FaceBase at all, but have similar problems and are peripherally connected. So we heard from Jennifer already, who is hopefully will be a FaceBase user going forward. But certainly we've heard from the clinical perspective. Everyone we know, Yang and Axel, who've already spoken. So maybe we don't need to introduce them. But I think the spanner in the works here is we've invited one of our colleagues from ophthalmology. And so Ben, maybe it would be useful for you to just say a little bit about what you're doing and your kind of interests, and so then we can open up for some questions. So
sure, of course. Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Ben Chu. I'm a glaucoma specialist, clinician scientist, and also the director of data science and AI for the Department of Ophthalmology here at USC. My research program focuses primarily on using big data to identify and understand issues in eye care, and then using technologies such as AI and telemedicine to address those issues. And so Carl and I have been collaborating for the past 2 years now on an initiative that we call Atlas, which is the AI Teleophthalmology in Los Angeles initiative. This is a collaboration between USC and the LA County Department of Health Services. And our goal here is to harness AI to advance eye care, specifically teleretinal care here in the county for its underserved patient population. And so what we've primarily been working on is developing the infrastructure to support the analysis of multimodal data, which is very common in ophthalmology, and then also using that data to develop AI algorithms that can be implemented into real-world clinical workflows. So Carl has been essential in this. I don't work with FaceBase. We have our own computing platform called IAI, which is based on Deriva ML, which is the system that underlies FaceBase. And this has been incredibly valuable because otherwise we would not be able to take data from all these different sources and devices and put them in one place and do anything meaningful with that data. So we've been very productive in terms of developing algorithms, and we're currently developing strategies to implement them into these real-world screening pathways so that patients with more severe eye disease, such as glaucoma, can be detected sooner and be referred for in-office care.
Great, thank you. Do you two have anyone else have any comments before we start? And I'll pose some questions. Anything else to add? And we have 50 minutes here, so comments from the audience would be great as well.
Just to set the record straight, I am an actual user of
FaceBase.
I'm on both sides, but I've been for much of the past 15 years, I've been more of a user than an actual contributor.
Okay, excellent. Well, I stand corrected.
You have to take Carl's comments lightly because he's probably maybe referring talking about that.
I was talking about that, yeah. So there were kind of two themes that I think came up that maybe it would be worth exploring a little bit. And I think they're somewhat related, but this notion, and it came up yesterday quite a bit as well, especially in the context of related health domains, the importance of multimodal data and some of the challenges that show up with multimodal data, and especially kind of what we've seen to some extent as we're extending FaceBase more to the dental and oral domains, and then what we've seen with NIDCD and with the ophthalmology examples and the multimodality of the data and the nature of that. So maybe we could discuss kind of your thoughts about Sorry, I don't, you're over my shoulder here. Don't mean to ignore you. So maybe it would be worth spending some time and explore what you see as the challenges and opportunities of multimodal data, what it means to you. And again, we heard in Jennifer's talk, I believe yesterday, about again the thrust within NIH with multimodal. So let me pose that as a topic of discussion to start with. And your thoughts?
Sure, I can start in terms of the ophthalmology use case. It's no surprise that in ophthalmology, the diseases that have had the most success in terms of AI and screening strategies have been unimodal in detection. So diabetic retinopathy, which is a very common eye disease, can be detected solely in a fundus photograph. So a quick picture of the retina and somebody can take a look at it, or now we have FDA approved AI algorithms can detect if you have diabetic retinopathy. The challenge is that many diseases can't be detected just through a simple fundus photograph, and this extends to glaucoma. So as a glaucoma specialist, when I'm diagnosing someone, I'm looking at a whole range of data, and this includes data from the EHR, such as their age, their race, their visual acuity, intraocular pressure. But then I'm also looking at diagnostic data, visual fields, and imaging data, such as OCTs. And so I am the integrator currently, but this makes it very hard to accurately diagnose glaucoma patients if you just have a fundus photograph. And this is work that we're currently doing to demonstrate this limitation of any sort of unimodal approach. There are many challenges to working with multimodal data. The first is that you need somewhere to store all this data. And so that is where IAI comes in. But we also have a lot of trouble because this is real world data that comes from EHRs or devices that are poorly DICOM compliant, and it's very hard to assemble all of this data. And so to have a computing platform with ingest tools and curation tools, this becomes extremely valuable because otherwise this work couldn't be done. And actually there's one more step, which is in terms of the multimodal data, there is a new omics, which is something called oculomics, which is using data from the eye to predict the presence of disease or outcomes of disease in the rest of the body. So now we're not just talking about eye data, but in fact data across the entire body. And so this really highlights the importance of the multimodal approach, not just in ophthalmology, but really for the entire body.
Yeah. I want to go to Jennifer, but I would like you to also comment. I know you've written, and this came up yesterday, I believe, in the conversation as well, as we're talking about multimodal data. I know you've written a paper on the limitations of OMOP for ophthalmology and the inadequacy. And as we talk about multimodal data, just maybe if you could make a comment or two about that.
Yeah, sure. So data standards is a big issue. Axel raised this in his talk. And currently, there are several common data models. One common one that we use is the International Classification of Diseases for disease diagnoses. There's something called SNOMED, which is disease diagnoses plus exam findings. So there is a need for a common data model to better represent all of the data concepts that we might be working with. And so one is OMOP, which has really received a lot of attention recently. It has had strong support from the NIH, and this is a data standard that we hope to be able to conform all of our data to, because in the future, you can imagine when we're ingesting data from different sources and different institutions, there needs to be some way of harmonizing this data so that we can work with it. And so this is also a very important aspect of having a computing platform that you can custom tailor to adhere to broader data standards.
Jennifer, I don't want to ignore you. So your thoughts on the multimodal data and the clinical.
I think it's really important. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about the different types of data and thinking about Beckwith-Wiedemann syndrome and also my experience in the cancer space is that a lot of the data sets that are out there are through the Children's Oncology Group. And one of the challenges is that it's a single entry point. So if you go back for data that's 20 years old, and it turns out that patient was diagnosed with Beckwith-Wiedemann syndrome, for example, or any syndrome after the initial data set was entered, you can't necessarily know if that patient really did or didn't have BWS, and you can't annotate it further. So something like this, a platform where the data can be annotated over time, connected as you have all these different aspects of data, is really important. And even thinking about the multimodal approach, if you do exome sequencing in all of my patients, you're only going to find a genetic change in the rare type of BWS that has the genetic change in 10% of the patients. You need the methylation data on top of the genomic sequence to actually make the clinical diagnosis in many places. So I think being able to put all of this together in the same place and then add the spatial data or the facial data or all of those other pieces to it is going to be key, both for discovery, but also maybe even for developing new molecular or ways to diagnose these genetic diseases. I mean, there's all sorts of AI apps you can use now to say, okay, what do you think is the most likely disease based on a picture of the patient? But if you can get more granular than that, and separating the rasopathy example in the previous talk also was a good there, where there's different faces that you can see, but they looked very similar to each other by the human eye. Can we use this multimodal data to make those diagnoses, just like you're doing in the eye, but can we use it as predictors of other aspects? Because can I scan a facial image and predict if this particular patient is going to develop cancer? That would be much easier than having to screen them every 3 months for the first 7 years of their life.
Yeah, I want to maybe make a comment from a slightly different perspective. I'm just reminded by Helen's talk yesterday about knowing your community, that who are the people using the data, right? And so when we look at the data we have in FaceBase, these different data, we look at people who are basic scientists, who are doing translational work, and clinicians, and looking at how one of the ways to build this community is really to use FaceBase to bring people together, right? And then using this approach, looking at a clinical disease, and then maybe some animal model that can really help to bridge that gap and then build this type of collaboration. The other areas, craniofacial disease doesn't happen in isolation. It could be something related to eye or kidney, and then so that another way is how we bring the different institutes together to use these different data, have an understanding about the human disease. And finally, the point Jennifer was talking about, these rare disease that each site will only have very limited numbers of patients, and how do we use a FaceBase, for example, to bring these resources together in a different data type, and then to enhance the power.
I think that's a really interesting point, and kind of riffing a little bit on Helen's talk yesterday and the lessons learned, right? So we look at these large language models and all these machine learning things. We'll talk about machine learning in a moment, right? I think there's a risk that will say, oh, problem solved. We're going to integrate all this multimodal data by throwing it into this wonderful AI machine. It will automatically figure out how to stitch these things together. And what we learned from AlphaFold was the exact opposite, right? Which is what the reason why they came up with the wonderful results is because somebody paid the attention to getting the high quality data that went into that. And so I think, part of what you're saying is, could we leverage a platform like FaceBase as the integrated platform for creating? Maybe we use machine learning as tools to facilitate that, but ultimately it's the experts that have to intervene and decide, how these integration points are going to be created, and that will create the foundation for these new discoveries. So I think there is a danger of saying, oh, well, just throw it into the AI sausage maker and wonderful stuff will come out. And I think, from Helen's example, what we know is that is probably not a path to success.
That's correct.
So, and this notion of community, can we leverage things like FaceBase as more broadly, bringing in other communities, but as a way of focusing and kind of activating that activity. And then I got in the way of Axel. So Axel, now you get to back clean up here.
Yeah, no, so so what coming from the work of the working group, right? So the one thing that really, well, that I can think about like is this enormous complexity of the data and this like sheer, like it's this big mass of data, the many different formats and so on. And it's hard to tell like where to even start with like trying to integrate and, you know, align and so on. Something that I mentally keep going back to is the example of the protein data bank that we heard and structure of protein data. And because it's I think that both the systems, but also the community was probably decades ahead of everybody else. And I think it's worth thinking very carefully about the lessons learned from that, because that's really what was at the, you know, was the foundation for this, you know, early success that I talked about of methods like AI methods for determining 3D protein structure, right? So it's there are multiple aspects of this. One is from the onset, it was a very clearly defined singular problem defining the shape of proteins in three-dimensional space. But then the data is very quantitative in nature, and importantly, there are accepted standards for even measuring how good the data is, right? The resolution and other aspects of each of these structures, right? You can measure it, and that tells you how good the data is, right? And then having it all in one place using one unified data. But I think these, and along with that, like a community that is willing to share the data, that is used to sharing the data. So all of these are aspects that made this a success. And so my question is, you know, how can we translate this to the other data types that we're dealing with, right? So essentially, any data type that is in FaceBase, or like nearly all of them, are less quantitative in nature. They're, you know, I mean, maybe like sequence data is probably the hardest kind of data, but anything else comes with like a lot of uncertainty. For example, like say morphometric data, you know, like it has certain, you know, boundaries or like limits of how accurate it is. And then there are like the truly non-quantitative data types that are qualitative, right? Like say phenotypes that result from a genetic manipulation. And so what I keep thinking about, like, how do we get closer to making this measurable? And that is because, and it's something that is absolutely critical for feeding into, say, machine learning methods that we will come to. But then also, like, what I keep thinking about is like, to what extent can, like, because typically how this happens in the past is like humans look at the data and try to figure that out. Can we use these modern tools to do that and like really get accurate information? So these are just
so that's a really interesting.
How long we have a comment?
I was going to say, there's a lot of data in the PDB that's not totally quantifiable, okay? And the only way you get things quantifiable is you say, okay, this needs to be quantified. How do we quantify it? Then you set a group of people who are really interested. So one example is electron microscopy images. There was no definition of resolution for electron microscopy. So people started a long time ago saying, how do we define resolution? And there's finally a method that seems to work that people will agree on. So the problem with everything that I'm saying now is that everything takes time and we're all impatient. So the question is, can you figure out with the data that you have, like pick things that are absolutely essential that you must have in order to get and figure out what it is you want to figure out, like what is it, what's your goal? And then just do the brick by brick methodology, which is really boring, but in the end, it pays off. I would hope that it wouldn't be 50 years to do that. I would hope that if there were little working groups that would just take the really most vexing problems and straighten them out. So what I heard yesterday, for example, in medical records, which was just a big mishmash of words that nobody could do anything with, some attempt to actually, get it so that you could do searches on it. So I don't know how, this is a sociologic problem, not a scientific problem. I mean, scientific, yes, but you need sociology.
So I just wanted to make sure that we get a comment from Benedict Halgrimson in the chat. A key focus of our syndrome-related work now is the potential to use 3D facial imaging to predict underlying disease severity. This does appear to be the case for heritable thoracic aortopathy. Thank you,
Benedict.
Probably misspelled
Can you read
it.
the rest of that? Because Marfan's, Loeys-Dietz, VEDS, for example, but may well be true in other syndromes.
I mean, I think this conversation brings up an interesting philosophical question. So one of the things we've seen in the ophthalmology case, I'll speak for Ben, which becomes kind of interesting is we're looking at an assessment of images and making a referral based on that. And what we see is there's, is there objectives or subjective? How big is a big tongue, right? Do you have, should you be referred for glaucoma? So we literally went through the exercise of looking at 9 experts and saying yes or no, 9, 7, whatever it was, right? There's a divergence of opinion. So one of the things we're really been interested in is, as you go through this and we're looking at these clinical cases where there is some difference of opinion, how do you incorporate those differences of opinion into the labeling and into the machine learning algorithms so that you have something that's clinically relevant? And I think as we look at the combination of both the multimodal data and applied to clinical settings, how do we incorporate the expert opinion where it might not be a yes or no answer, right? How do we incorporate that into the labeling and the modeling? Thoughts?
Yeah, no, this was a big problem that we've had to deal with in the teleophthalmology community, right? Which is that when we're assessing these images, there's inherent variability. And depending on who's grading your images, your disease may or may not be detected. And that really limits the scalability of any types of telemedicine approaches when you have this type of variability, because then you need trained graders, you need people who ideally are highly reproducible, but how do you guarantee this? And so this is where we've really benefited from having IAI and these algorithms that we can compare, because here we can very precisely define the referral cutoff so that we have a certain sensitivity or specificity. And we do see that among human graders, there's a wide range of sensitivity and specificity that is not even correlated with their level of experience. So it really becomes a number generator, random number generator in terms of the care that patients are receiving, which is just not ideal as we try to properly allocate healthcare resources. And so, again, this whole initiative has been really valuable in an effort to provide more standardized and reproducible care.
Any other comments?
I would say that, so thanks for turning all the way around. I think it really depends on the experience, and also depends on the number of samples that you have. Like when we built that macroglossia scoring system, we had a medical student agnostically look at my notes and a plastic surgeon's notes, who both saw the same patients, and we used different adjectives to describe what we saw, and they were able to bin them. And then we worked together for 15 years, the plastic surgeon and myself. And I am curious to see if another group and other folks have started using this, but to see with either another data set or another group of raters on the same data set, what would happen. But for that to happen, we'd actually have to upload the images or all the clinical data to someone else, and more over the images. The images, that's another issue, and that's a whole other issue asked before about what data could be uploaded, what we have approval for. Image analysis, because it's identifiable as is challenging. And part of our consent process is, do you agree to images for research or images for just presentations and research, and there's lots of different choices. However, we haven't specifically talked about images for research that we're sharing with others. It's all been research that we have those images, but there's ways to mask them and turn them into data points, then we can easily share them.
I think, with respect to that, that's why things like what Peter is doing, I think, is important, in that if we could be generating, because there's two sides of the coin, right? There's like, we want to be able to determine what the graders would see, what the labeling, the quality of the labeling would be. And then there's a dearth of input data. So to the extent that we could use some of these generative techniques to create reference data sets that we can use to evaluate quality of graders and quality of labeling and so on, that seems to me to be important, especially for rare diseases and things like that. This shows up in craniorate too, right? And that just grading the degree of craniostenostosis, there's variability in that. And if you were able to generate reference data sets, that would maybe help drive community activity.
Yes, Thomas.
Yeah, so we pointed out earlier that data models like OMOP are becoming more common, and we need more data points into these types of algorithms. One thing that is a caveat of a lot of these OMOP models is that they're not typically connected to the imaging databases. Typically, they'll be stored in XNAT or some other system. You actually have to link them up correctly. And I'll just point out that this is a real benefit of things like FaceBase, because you've aggregated these into a common data set, right?
Right.
And because you guys have a lot of expert input and research community that's working on this, this is different than something like a large database that you would put your data resource in, like Bibly. They don't necessarily have the community around it, and it's just people for a localized database that sort of incorporates all that knowledge together.
I think so. I appreciate that. That's a great point. And it's possible, as we look at these clinical settings, the multimodal data and the broadening out, this notion of, we heard yesterday about FaceBase as a hybrid repository. So that integration point, that's the value proposition here. Kind of the broad, not deep. But can you do that in a quality way that drives clinical relevance? Yeah.
I do have a question in terms of what are the limits in terms of bringing in new data types, right? Here we're talking about standardized data. That's great. That's pretty easy to bring in because people have already agreed upon terminology for representing that data. But at some point, the data is not so well defined, right? And there's a lot of effort as we've put into ingesting different types of data. So what are the limits of FaceBase or IAI or any sort of multimodal data integration platform? And when do we say, sorry, we can't support your data?
Well, I have an opinion.
No, I'm just curious because we're having a discussion here about.
Well, I think there is this question of how good is good enough, and that there was a number of years ago in the e-science, or what do we call those things back then? We were talking about this yesterday. This notion that there's a life cycle to ontology and standards, and just because you don't have a global agreement that's recognized by the United Nations doesn't mean you can't document and can't annotate. And so, to answer your question, as long as there's some agreement and kind of term reuse, and we build notion of life cycle and evolution into that process, I think we could be quite open. Now I remember when we started doing single cell, and it was like people were coming up with cell group names, and it's like, well, can we give this thing a name? No, I'm not willing to commit to a name. It's like, well, just make something up, call it Fred. It's at least I know what I'm talking about, right? So just this recognition that language is evolving and terms are evolving. They're not set in stone. So can we build that into how we build these models? So at least we can have a progression going forward. So that would be, my opinion. Axel.
Yeah. To add to this, so I think it's also important to keep in mind that there's a difference between just bringing in the data versus truly integrating the data, right? Bringing in data is relatively easy if you don't care about how well it's integrated. I mean, it's still like new data types, you need to like develop new tools to onboard them. But the hard part is usually then to make them interact with other types of data, right? Because that requires like truly understanding what the data is, right? For example, understanding what is that cell population so that you can link it based on that to say an in-depth study of that cell population in some other model, right? That's usually the hard part. Now, the challenge that I see is that it already, like even without bringing in any additional data type in FaceBase, there's so many different types of data that there are sheer endless possibilities of what you may want to connect with what and try to figure out a way. So I think it's worth thinking about like what is the, I think there are lots of like low-hanging fruits that you know you could focus on. What would be the ones that would be most impactful for the community? Like what exact connections are needed? And I don't know the answer to this. This is something that needs to emerge out of discussions with the community. But
I think that's an interesting question. Did you have a comment or just?
No, I had a question to maybe muddy the waters even more. Is that the data that we're contributing to FaceBase and data that we're usually using in general is not a static thing. We're labeling this data, but that understanding of the data changes over time, right? So take, for example, metopic cenostosis, something that we've been contributing data for. The edge cases of those things may, over time, we may say what we thought was an abnormal pathologic state is no longer that. And so, I think that behooves us as an organization, you especially, to think about what does that mean to change the classification or to be flexible as things change over time, as our understanding grows about all the different data classes that we have.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I just wanted to add to what Benjamin said. So there's a fine line between you being a sort of like a domain specific repository and then veering it to generalists. And if you don't have some sort of guides or guidelines, you just end up just taking everything and then data won't be integrated well and it will just be like a generalist repository. So that's something to consider as we think about data models, even nomenclature, what type of data you want to put in, what minimum standards the data has to have, and so on.
Right, I think there's a continuum between kind of the real describe everything in fine levels of granularity. That's 100% correct. And in my view of a generalist repository is I have a couple of keywords which I make up, right? And there's got to be something between a bunch of keywords and this super detail. And what shows up in that middle space also, to your point, changes over time, right? We know that now the whole point is to get new knowledge and our language is going to change based on that. So, yeah.
So when you're building a dictionary, if you build it so it's rigid, so when I use the word standard, that doesn't mean immutable. It means you have a standard which works for 2025, knowing that in 2027, something is going to change. And so you have to build into the way you build your dictionaries of standards that ability to continue to improve. Otherwise, perfection is the enemy of the good, and that's not what you want.
Right.
I think that really is being just a highlight of FaceBase development. If I can just go back to Ben's question about how we bring different type of data into FaceBase, maybe Rob can just provide more comments on that. How we brought in enamel base, and then some of the recent collaborations with NIDCD and bringing this temporal bone imaging. All of this was just very carefully reviewed, and then looking at how the addition of this data will enhance the ability of FaceBase to provide this resource to support the research community, while at the same time really maintaining the standard. Maybe Rob, I'll just hate to put you on the spot, but you can just sort of talk a little bit more about how that worked out, and then we will continue to use that as a way to guide future practice to get back to Ben's question.
Yeah. So we've taken the approach of trying to identify, and through discussions with the subject matter experts that are within our user base, what are the minimal, kind of the minimal information. So you probably know there were these minimal information models that were under really active development 10, 15 or so years ago. And we were kind of inspired by that, as well as general survey of what do other repositories collect, what kind of attributes, so that we can be as interoperable and as descriptive as we can. But we tried to be, well, we went through different phases actually. And we settled on trying to identify something that was minimal, but still usable, right? So not minimal where the floor is defined by still being usably described, right? Because we also rely on our contributors and submitters of data to do the description of the data. So we don't have a big curation team that does it for them. But we still want the data to be well described so others can use it. So we focused on that, identifying that minimal set of attributes. And at times when we did collect more than minimal, it became a bit of an obstacle for data collection. And then certain attributes weren't really used. And so it was important to kind of work with our users to identify what are the essential attributes that they need. And then expanding to new data types sometimes is relatively simple. Like, okay, there's greater anatomical terms that we need, and it's just really expanding our vocabulary. So that's kind of relatively easy to do versus other cases where there's different whole new fields that need to be collected, and those require more dialogue with the knowledgeable members of our community. And so that happens, and we evolve our system a lot. And Jesse over there in Cranio, right, just with their team and with other data sets in mind, we made some subtle but significant changes to our patient demographics information, for example, in the past year. And so it is evolving, as Helen mentioned. That's very much a part of FaceBase, and our overall platform architecture is to be able to have something that can kind of adapt to new data types. And so I think a lot of it depends on just dialogue with members of our user community, which sometimes have been very structured. Sometimes it's more ad hoc, but just talking with members of our community about what they need. We've tested things in like third-party compute pipelines. Actually, Axel's team was involved in that a few years back, and really helped to validate that we had collected enough attributes so that data could be rerun through a pipeline. So a variety of things like like that. And I imagine that we'll have new members of the community that come in that we expand into new, more significantly new types of data. And I think that's kind of the process will continue. And we try to keep at that minimum, because it's kind of, when we have more attributes, if it's not useful, then it just kind of becomes an overhead that sort of drags down the process. So you have to be kind of careful about, not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, or however that saying goes.
Okay, so we're just about at noon.
We are. So anyone have any final comments? Anyone have a question?
I have a question.
Okay.
Summarize them. Yeah, contributing data is just open for institutions and big companies, or individuals can contribute? And the other question, which is who define the quality of data? Who filter them? They are good, bad, good quality? And the last thing is, if let's say my department, which is oral facial pain, oral medicine, we do a lot of imaging. If we want to create or participate and feed the FaceBase with some of our images and data, who's the portal for us?
So we should probably take this offline. There is a process. There's a form you fill out. It's reviewed by the NIDCR staff.
Along with us.
Was that
along with us.
along with
No,
us?
no.
And there is it's an open, anyone can contribute. It's an open platform, but there is a well-defined
Anyone
process.
can submit a request if
You
you
can
can.
submit a request to submit data, and then there is a process for making sure it fits, and all the appropriate releases and consents have been assigned, so we can follow up with
Is it a
you.
complex thing or just simple procedure?
I'm sorry?
Is it a complex procedure or?
No.
Very
No, it's a pretty short form,
It's a,
online form that you fill out.
there's a, so.
Do you mean the uploading data process or just the,
To start.
Just to
first,
start
then,
the-
You know,
the review,
after
yeah.
that, we'll have to agree because some files maybe I don't know if you have requirements for each file, especially
Well, we-
imaging and videos and things like that.
So you should talk to Chris,
Okay.
and we can fill you in on all those details. So unless there are any final comments, I think I'll wrap up.